Every story that's ever been put out there about the crash of 1984 or of 1983 or 85 or whatever the time period is, because it kind of shifts, in terms of video games failing is just pure horseshit. Like, that's not what happened. I was there as a kid. I saw it. There was no crash. There just wasn't. I'm going to do my best to get everyone to understand what really happened, because there's not one video that says the truth. There was no video game crash. It was all based on finances and fear, which is what all business failures succumb to eventually, out of greed. Just the sheer greed of trying to make profit. Okay. Now let's think about this, right? They called it the console market collapse of 1983. People called it a cataclysmic business event. But the narrative that the video game industry died is just wrong. I mean, the industry never died, at least in America, in the United States, and I'm sure in Japan also. When I was a kid, I wasn't going to go to Japan anytime soon, and we really didn't have a lot of coverage of other countries, and I didn't really care about what the hell was going on everywhere else, because America was kind of cool, right? It was dominated by the console market. Everywhere you went, everyone had some video game, whether it was the old Atari or, getting the 5200 or maybe the Commodore 64, which, let's face it, it was branded as a computer. It's really a home arcade console, but I digress. It was more about unsustainable business practices and trying to redirect consumer demand for specific items rather than eliminating, the market itself, which is what ended up happening, right? But these are the raw numbers, okay? These are the raw numbers based on what actually happened, but why it happened is the bigger picture. Allegedly, in 1982, we're talking about a $3.2 billion home game console market. But then 3 years later, it dropped to $100 million. Well, this decline had nothing to do with consumers, saying, hey, we hate video games. That's just not true. It has to do with systemic failures within the publishing structure itself. Pure greed, okay? One of the most destructive elements that no one talks about. It's referenced sometimes, but this is the factor that killed the home game console market. It was not demand for video games. It wasn't the fact that people lost interest. It wasn't that it was just losing money because no one cared about it. It was this industry standard, quote, buyback clause, unquote, which were embedded within these contracts between publishers like Atari, Coleco, and Mattel to mass retailers like Kmart and Sears, for example. So there were basically stipulations that were unconditional. They were guarantees that the video game makers, the publishers themselves, would repurchase all unsold inventory, which is absolutely insane. So think about it. Imagine if Nike came out with this amazing brand new sneaker and they sold, let's say Foot Locker 100 million pairs, and Foot Locker sells, 50 million. Well, then Nike says we're going to buy back 50 million, right? But now the price of the sneaker just depreciated. So you're going to say it took a loss and it was a failure when actually you just made too many and you were too happy about giving it away. Well, you made, Foot Locker a lot of money and you crashed. Well, if you're going to kill your own company like that, guess what happens? There's no more supply. So how could there possibly be a demand for something that no one wants because you're not making it? And that's essentially what happened. So between the publishers, the video game makers, and the retailers, Kmart and Sears, for example, these guys bought back from the stores whatever was unsold under a certain number. This practice became financially lethal when the market was swamped with all these low quality, unlicensed, so-called games. You know what I mean? They really weren't games. They were just being produced for the sake of production because they were losing money. So they started to just release everything. Again, imagine Nike suddenly saying, you know what, we're going to start releasing really low quality sneakers. Back in the 80s, at least where I grew up in Brooklyn, there was a really cheap sneaker called Olympians, which you could probably buy for $5 to $10 while everyone else is wearing the $40 to $80 Nikes and stuff. Well, basically Atari became the sellers of Olympians rather than selling Atari quality stuff. And that's another aspect of what killed it. So you got those two factors. So now you get the sheer volume of all these terrible games combined with the lack of technical barriers to the entry to the 2600, meaning everyone can have one. So you have this massive consumer base. You don't have any new games produced because they're losing money because they're making crap games, and they bought back all these other games so they can't afford to pay real good programmers and actually progress the industry. Instead, they held it back. So when the holiday, season of 82 came around, Christmas and everything, it's like all these retailers failed to clear their inventory of Atari and whatever other game console was out there. I don't think there was many. And they executed the buyback clause, at the beginning of 83. So now the publishers were forced to return cash. We're talking $20 to $30 per game, which is a lot of money, right? Because back then, everyone's like, oh, the cost of video games now. No, back then they were pretty expensive too, guys. It was you're talking a good $40 to $30 per game for an Atari 2600 game. It was ridiculous, right? And basically basically they couldn't sell them. So now the company bought them back. So where's the profits? There is no profits. So that means you got to start firing people. You fire people and then you lower your capital and you lower how many people you can employ to make good video games, right? So basically you have a lack of money, and then you have certain game publishers which are going to go bankrupt. I mean, that's what happened. There was one company called Apollo, and now, you have like Atari just suffering these financial losses. Now you have this alleged burial which took place, which I think, I don't think that they said get rid of all these games and let's bury it in like, a desert somewhere. I think someone was tasked with like the duty of getting rid of them, and someone came up with this really stupid idea to kind of throw it in the desert. I don't think that Atari mandated, hey, go out there and put it there. They just had nowhere to put them, so they didn't want to pay to, I guess, burn them, so they buried them. It was crazy. And it was just crazy. So you're talking about a crisis of capital management, a failure of inventory control, and just, consumer trust plummeted. Because why would you trust these companies now that they're giving you crap product after you spend all this money on a console? So you have Atari failing, and this is 1983 now, right? You have Atari failing. You have the home video game market just basically not surviving. However, the arcade market remained dominant and technically superior. We're talking about going to the arcade and playing games. It was undeniable. I mean, the industry during the early 1980s, $8 billion in 1982. So the home game console market, it's pretty good. $3.2 billion. I mean, how much is that now? Like $100 billion? But you're talking about $8 billion, 3 times the amount for the arcade games. All right. And then you're talking about a stabilization. Look, after 83, there was no problem. They kept progressing. I'm talking about the arcades now. The games were still getting better. Arcades were still popping up everywhere. The controls were getting better. The graphics were getting better. They were the ones hiring all the people to make all these amazing, games. Here, I'll give you an example. In 1983, Nintendo released Mario Brothers. That's how far back we're going. Not Super Mario Brothers, but we're talking about Mario Brothers. The one where it's like Mario and Luigi and they have to kind of bump their heads up to kind of get the turtles to kind of flip over. And after they go on their back, you kick them off the screen with that little pound in the middle. Well, everyone loved that crap. And by the way, also in 1983, this game called Dragon's Lair, which was featured in season 2 of Stranger Things, one of my favorite video games of all time, which I get to play on Daphne every now and then, by the way. I digress. Daphne's not my girlfriend. She's a programming software. She's a piece of software. Maybe she is my girlfriend, a piece of ass. Anyway, I digress. And, laser discs. And that, of course, was the foundation for Space Age, Dragon's Lair 2, and a bunch of other weird games that came from Japan and shit, right? So now you just go ahead 2 years later. 1985, Sega came out with this arcade called Sega System 16. What's that? A 16-bit arcade game. Now you're talking about games like Hang On, all right? Hang On was one of the best motorcycle games ever. Even if you hated motorcycles, you loved Hang On because you're basically driving a motorcycle handle, and it was great, and it felt good, and it had vibration, and you could actually turn the damn thing as if you were, accelerating a real bike. And Hang On wasn't just about playing a motorcycle game. It basically had simulated 3D environments, and it was copied that kind of 3D technique in order to create those kind of graphics and that look by both the Nintendo Entertainment System, the original NES, not the SNES, and the Sega Master System. So, but of course they failed miserably because they weren't 16-bit, they were 8-bit. So now a year later, so we went from 85 to 86, well, Outrun, another racing game, but this time you're in a car. Really fun game. Even if you don't like racing games, you liked Outrun. Why? Because the controls feel good, it looked good. It used sprites. It had a hydraulic motion cabinet. So whenever you went to the left, the whole thing went to the left. You went to the right, the whole thing went to the right. It was an immersive experience. It was fun. And these games sold like for a lot of money. Like the actual arcade cabinet, you're talking like a few $1,000, and they sold 30,000 units. Now, 30,000 units may not sound like a lot, but in terms of selling that game individually and making the cabinets and shipping it out and everything, the return on profit for one game was monumental. So they kept making more. Fast forward to 1987, Capcom. Now we know what's coming when we hear that name, right? They came out with an arcade system called the CPS-1. Now these are all code words for the actual CPU hardware that was contained within the machines, right? And, the CPS basically stood for Capcom Play System 1. And it was basically a standardized platform that would lead to all types of games that was built off of an engine. Think of the Unreal Engine of today. That would be the Capcom CPS-1 system, right? and it had standardized architecture, and it basically reduced development costs while increasing the visual fidelity. So the games looked better and they felt better. A couple years later, what do we get? Street Fighter 2 in 91 running on Capcom's CPS-1. And you're talking about the world being introduced really to fighting games at that point. It's funny, everyone forgets, but there was a really old game out there called, it was called Karate Champ, and it didn't have buttons. It had 2 joysticks. So basically had to use both of your hands for each individual player. And the left one, you control the player, and the right one, he could either kick or punch depending on what you did. And they wore the traditional karate gis and everything. And that to me was the first real fun fighting game. I don't know if there was anything else that like preceded it, like a stick fighter type of game. Not that the game was called Stick Fighter, but I'm saying like a lower quality graphics game that was out there in the arcade. I didn't hear about it. I didn't play it. But then you had Street Fighter, the first one, then Mortal Kombat, and then Street Fighter 2. It was just crazy. So actually, I think Street Fighter 2 came out before Mortal Kombat 2, but I digress. So, you're talking about that game alone sold 200,000 cabinets. You want to know how much money that single game made? $12 billion. Not from selling the arcade cabinet, but from the quarters pumped into the machine. So just multiply that by how many, people played the game. And then, of course, the home ports and everything else. This is allegedly during a time where video games were dead. Are you kidding me? All right. So anyway, just move right along. 1993, Sega comes out with Virtua Fighter. Now, back then, this is when the virtual reality stuff really started to kick in. This is way before anyone was wearing goggles because they didn't have them. At least it wasn't for consumer markets. They did have them hidden in the army and in various, military outlets. But I digress, right? Go back and look up your history. You'll see that the first VR goggles came out, I think, in the 50s, or at least the schematics for them. But so Virtua Fighter came out. I didn't like it because it kind of looked like everyone was floating through the air and shit. And, the 3D polygons didn't really appeal to me and I hated it. And later on, you had some other people that were kind of adapting it. But, again, Virtua Fighter, Street Fighter 2, Outrun, and all these other games, all these innovations during a time where allegedly the video game market was dead. No, it wasn't dead. It was just stupid business decisions from the major companies at the time who failed. And then you got Capcom and Sega basically supporting the damn industry, proving that people really did still like to play arcade games. Now, you have to look at another thing that happened during that exact same time period between 1982 and the early 90s, right? The home computer market. They were basically gaming consoles in disguise. Strategic marketing said, oh, this is a learning machine. Why? Because you had the Apple II being marketed as, with those green monochrome monitors, and you had the IBM, the International Business Machine, being marketed as for business. You had the Apple dominating the student market. You had IBM dominating the alleged business market, as if, you couldn't use either of them interchangeably, which you could. Then you had C64, my favorite freaking computer of all time. Commodore 64 comes out 1982, right when the movie Tron came out. All this amazing stuff happening at once. The Commodore 64 became the best-selling single computer model of all time. It was based on MOS technology 6510, a modification of the venerable 6502 architecture used by the Atari 2600, Apple II, and later the Nintendo Entertainment System. It had superior color. It only has 16 colors, but later on, people who made demos figured out how to get, I think, up to 4,000, which is kind of cool. The sound was incredible via the SID chip, the infamous SID chip, the first version of which had a glitch where you can basically fake a fourth channel, even though it only had 3. 64 kilobits of RAM, kilobits. Okay, we're talking like not even the size of a normal picture. Like, your phone right now on its lowest, crappiest setting is probably going to take a picture at like 5 megabytes. So 64 kilobytes, that's like 0.6. That's 0.64 of one megabyte. And that's how much computing power, that's how much memory that you had to work with the Commodore 64. And yet they managed to port Super Mario Brothers, Dragon's Lair, this one awesome game called Skate or Die, which is basically the home version of 720, but not really. It was completely different. But hey, at least we got our version of playing, skateboarding. And yeah, Dragon's Lair sucked. And yeah, all these games didn't look anything like, the arcade versions, but they were really fun games. And that's why it was released. It was basically a home gaming console. And it provided an open development environment. It supported a massive continuous stream of high quality game ports. It had original titles from the mid to late 80s. So consumers were buying computers. They just made the pivot. They went from buying the consoles to buying the computers, which were marketed as computers, even though they were gaming consoles in disguise with a keyboard attached, because Atari failed to meet its profits. And so they decided to bury some cartridges. And here comes Commodore deciding that they're going to remarket or rebrand their system as being a console. Now, if you don't think that's true, think about what came out a couple couple of years later in 1987. The Commodore Amiga 500, my second most favorite computer system. I always fantasize about getting an Amiga 500 because it was like, okay, this is the C64 on steroids. And I always wondered, like, what would it be like to actually play a game with a Commodore Amiga? I'm going to be honest with you. I was disappointed when I got it. I had a lot of fun with it, and I thought that it was unique. I thought it was different, but it wasn't the big deal that it was marketed to be. It was just marketed so beautifully and so perfectly. Yes, it definitely represented a huge leap in home computer technology. Definitely. It had a dedicated graphics and sound chip, separate, basic, the input and output structure. Again, a separate chip for that. So you're talking 3 CPUs, which I actually used as individual controllers for these 3 things, which was previously unheard of, even though the Commodore 64 had the processor not only inside of the keyboard itself, which was the entire computer, but also separate in each of the external disk drives. So that's another thing, right? I'm getting way ahead of myself and too technical for you guys who don't want to hear this crap, but too bad, right? So the Amiga 500, the marketing basically was branded as a multimedia computer focusing on graphics. Okay. Oh, well, you can make graphics with this. No. If you look at the bundles, in 1989, they released something called the Batman Pack. So they made a Batman video game, which looked awesome. It played like pure shit. It was one of the worst games ever to be created, but the graphics looked cool. And the box of the Amiga 500, it was like, hey, this is the Batman Pack. You get this Batman video game and you get the computer to play all these other video games. So it was amazing. It was amazing because Batman was a huge hit and the Amiga 500 just skyrocketed because of the marketing strategy. That's why the Amiga 500 became so popular. Not necessarily because it was so superior in terms of what it could do, because the potential was never fully reached, I feel. Like I said, a little bit disappointed. I still enjoyed the Commodore 64 more, to be honest, but I was really happy that I got it. It just wasn't what I expected. If you want to know what the Amiga could have became, then just look at what the SNES did, because it basically took everything that the Amiga was supposed to be and it made it better. The Amiga even tried to release something called what was it again? It was that the home CD system, because CDs were big back then, the predecessors to DVDs and Blu-ray discs. But I digress. So you're talking about the 6502 architecture, which is first basically made popular in the Commodore 64, and it had a lot of cost effectiveness. It was incredibly cheap. I think they were like $25 each. Okay. So it was really cheap to buy. And then you had the NES, which employed it. And if it wasn't for the C64, there would be no home gaming. There just wouldn't be. There would be no Nintendo Entertainment System. And, here comes Nintendo with the NES. 1985, during the time that allegedly arcades were dead or that the consoles were dead. Well, if it came out in 85, that means that Nintendo was making this somewhere in 83, allegedly during the global crash. It wasn't a crash. It was just poor business strategy. Let's face it. So it was unbelievable. That system changed everything because they already had all of the Nintendo hardware being encased in large arcade machines. For example, they had Super Mario Brothers basically released on Nintendo NES hardware, but a little bit tweaked, a little more memory, a little more CPU power, and they didn't take much, away from that, and they didn't really give you anything less than what you saw in the arcade. So when you played the Super Mario Brothers at home, it was almost an identical port. There's certain things that aren't 100%, like I think, World 2.1 or World 2.2. There was like a little bit of things that are slightly different that you could notice, and I'm sure there's a lot of other worlds in there that are completely different. But I remember saying, this is really, really close to the arcade, and I was satisfied. I wasn't complaining or bitching and moaning. And they also had a very cool baseball game just called Baseball. And they did port Kung Fu Master, but instead of calling it Kung Fu Master, they just called it Kung Fu. I don't know why they took out the Master. Maybe it was, a marketing license issue, but whatever. And I remember that Konami came out of they did a lot of ports. I remember Double Dribble. It was a basketball game where, whenever you went for a dunk, it gave you like this really over pixelated, low frame rate kind of video sequence, which looked kind of cool. And, the guy would say double dribble whenever the track screen was on. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Why? Because I love this shit. I love arcades, and I wish I could go back in time and fucking do it all again, but I can't. So I'm here stuck in the precipice of 2026 talking about this shit to you people. Why? Because it's fun. So, you're talking that basically Minoru Aruka, I'm saying his name all wrong, but Minoru Arukawa understood the root of the collapse of the business chaos, not the consumer disinterest. Disinterest with the two non-negotiable structural controls. What I said is that, Arikawa decided to come out with these amazing features of the system. He created something called the 10 NES lockout chip, which basically was a type of block, a physical physical barrier that prevented the use of unlicensed third-party cartridges. So it gave Nintendo absolute control over who could publish games for their system, preventing the unlicensed garbage that was released by Atari, right? All these clone cartridges that people were just making and not really, they basically destroyed the system because of poor games. But later, people figured out a way around that too, but I digress. They had mandatory quality control. What a shock. Nintendo enforced an incredibly strict limitation on the number of titles a third-party publisher could release per year because they wanted the quality of the games to supersede the quantity, ensuring a curated experience for the consumer market of video games. This restored retailer and consumer faith in the home gaming console market. Had Atari paid attention, and Atari didn't completely die, at least not in name, because they did come out with a lot of cool stuff afterwards in the arcades, and they did try to make a comeback with the Jaguar, but they were just trying to play catch up at that point because they were already done. So if you remember the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the big box was released with remember Rob the robot? You had to play Gyromite, and then you had the light gun, which they called the Zapper instead of calling it a gun. I mean, it was a gun because there were two games in the arcade that the NES released, like I said, on NES hardware, called Duck Hunt and what was it? Hogan's Alley? No, Hogan's Alley is a freaking, what was it? Gunsmoke? No, Gunsmoke was an arcade game. What was it called? I refuse to look it up. Maybe it'll come to my brain before I stop talking. But it was a game where basically you had to shoot the bad guys, but no blood came out. It was just these like little paper mache guys that when you hit the target, it was cardboard and it spun around. But they packaged a dual cartridge in there. So on one cartridge, I believe it was one cartridge, you had both Duck Hunt and Gyromite. Gyromite was just, these little red and blue things that you had to use Rob, who was staring at the screen, and these flashes would come, and Rob the robot would physically pick up these gyros that were spinning all the time and drop it on top of either the red or blue weight, and it would cause the thing to lower or raise in the screen. I'm not really describing it well because it's hard to visualize unless you actually, it's hard to conceptualize unless you see it visually. But in 85, you're talking about the home gaming experience was being dominated by incredible video games. Super Mario Brothers. I mean, it was the lead title and it sold millions of copies, 60 million units worldwide. I mean, video games never lost their appeal. Video games never died. Don't believe the narrative, okay? The seeds of modern gaming for today, the reason why you have a PlayStation, or if you're smart, an Xbox Series X like me, because we're both smart, right? The late 80s and the early 90s were not the failure of the arcade market. It was the birth of today's industry. You're talking about Quantum Link for the Commodore 64. Want to know what that is? An online an online service that you needed a modem, a classic modem connected to the back of your computer that you had to use a dial-up phone for, and it was the precursor to America Online. No Quantum Link. And yeah, it was called Quantum Link way before anyone cared about quantum physics. There was also a TV show called Quantum Leap, not to be confused, but I digress. And then you had Prodigy, which was another service very similar to AOL that didn't really catch on, but of course, because of the name, and it was more geared towards adults, whereas Quantum Link was more for kids and learning, and that's how they promoted it. But then it became AOL, which basically was ASL, DSL, and every other SL you can think of, if you know what I'm talking about, right? What was it? Something Latin Love 69. Anyway, I digress. For those of you who know what the hell I'm talking about, those chat rooms with I think it was a 23 or 29 person limit. And the first thing that people said when you jumped in these rooms was ASL. It's age, sex, and location. That's all they wanted to know. And then they would send you a digitized picture allegedly of them that looked horrible because it probably was like 50 pixels or some shit, like a 50 by 5. But anyway, I'm getting really technical. Why? Because it's fun. I like it. You don't like it? Tough shit. But you're talking about, this was the period where you had Electronic Arts being born. Electronic Arts, which is still around today, and a subscription service on your Xbox, okay? You're talking about all these major video games coming out. The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, which everyone forgot about, Sim City, which is still around, Wing Commander, which everyone forgot about, but Age of Empire, which is still around. I mean, this was allegedly a dead period? No, this was the transitional phase where the industry shed its amateur economics and matured into the structured, multi-platform, successful, highly profitable business that exists today in 2026. This was the foundation laid by the resilience of the arcades and the popularity of home computers. This is what led directly to the console wars between Nintendo and Sega during the 16-bit era, followed by the global market takeover by the Sony PlayStation, later challenged by the Microsoft Xbox, which is still around, both of those guys. Arcades never died, video games never died, and if you're smart, you'll never die.